The letter was still in her hand when Edwin Wallace looked at her like she was a ghost standing in the middle of his kitchen, flour on the counter, and a rifle leaning against the doorframe. And the silence between them stretched out so long and so sharp that Grace Turner felt her entire future balancing on the edge of a single breath. "You need to leave," he said, and his voice was flat and final and carrying something underneath it that she could not quite name yet, something between fury and fear, something between rejection and a desperation so deep it had no bottom. "Right now, tonight. I'll saddle a horse and you'll ride back to Harlan's Creek, and you'll never mention to a single soul that you came here." Grace did not move. She had traveled 430 miles on a stagecoach that smelled of tobacco and wet wool, then another 18 miles in the back of a grain wagon driven by a man who spoke no English and asked no questions, and she had arrived at the gate of the Wallace Ranch at past 7 in the evening with a carpet bag, a dress that had been better before the journey, and a letter of introduction that she now understood had been written for an entirely different man. She had come to the wrong ranch. She had arrived at the wrong place, for the wrong man under the wrong name, and the rancher who stood before her with his jaw set and his dark eyes full of something that looked terribly close to wanting, had told her to leave. And Grace Turner, who had fled St. Louis with nothing but the clothes on her back and a borrowed name and a secret so dangerous it could get her killed, had absolutely nowhere to go. That was where everything began to fracture and reform itself into something neither of them had planned. 3 weeks before Grace Turner stood in Edwin Wallace's kitchen refusing to be sent away, she had been sitting in a courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of 1882, watching a judge write her name down on a document that would have made her the wife of a man named Clifton Hargrove. Clifton Hargrove was 44 years old. He owned a shipping company, 2 warehouses on the river, and approximately 11 people whose lives he controlled through debt, fear, or blackmail. He was also the man who had ordered her father's death when her father had refused to falsify shipping records that would have hidden the origin of stolen government cattle. Grace had been 19 at the time. She was 24 now. She had spent 5 years watching Clifton Hargrove sit across from her family at Sunday dinners while her mother smiled her tight, frightened smile, and Grace had spent 5 years building a plan as quietly and as carefully as a person builds anything they cannot afford to get wrong. The plan involved the Matrimonial Correspondence Bureau of Kansas City, a woman named Mrs. Edna Pritchett who ran the bureau and who had agreed, for a fee Grace had saved in coins hidden inside a boot, to forward a letter of introduction to a rancher in New Mexico Territory named Warren Dale Wallace. Warren Dale Wallace had advertised for a bride. He was 32 years old, owned land in the territory, and according to Mrs. Pritchett's notes, was a man of sober habits and reasonable temperament. What Mrs. Pritchett had failed to mention, because she had not known, was that Warren Dale Wallace had died of a fever in February, 6 weeks before Grace's letter arrived at the Wallace Ranch. The ranch had passed to his younger brother. Edwin Wallace was 29 years old, had never advertised for a bride, had never sought out a wife, and had received his brother's mail unopened in a pile on the kitchen table, because he had spent the past 6 weeks trying to keep the ranch from falling apart while grief did its quiet, devastating work on his insides. Grace had not known any of this when she climbed down from the grain wagon at the end of the long dirt drive and walked up to the front door of the ranch house with her carpet bag and her letter of introduction and her borrowed hope. She had knocked. Edwin had opened the door. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something that is not supposed to be there, and she had looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she knows immediately, in the part of her that has no language, that this person is going to matter. Then she had handed him the letter and he had read it, and the silence had turned dangerous. "This letter is addressed to Warren," he said. "Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact dropped into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water." "I know his name was Warren Wallace," Grace said carefully. The bureau in Kansas City sent me to Wallace Ranch. I was told this was Wallace Ranch. My brother died 6 weeks ago." The words landed on her with a weight she had not expected, because she had not known Warren Wallace and had no reason to grieve him, but the grief in Edwin's voice was so raw and unguarded that she felt it anyway, the way you feel cold air that is not directed at you. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it entirely. "You need to leave," he said, and that was where the story truly started. She did not leave, not because she was stubborn, though she was. Not because she had nowhere to go, though that was also true. She did not leave because in the 3 seconds of silence that followed his command, a rider appeared at the end of the drive, and even at that distance, even in the fading evening light, Grace recognized the shape of the man on the horse. It was Harlan Briggs, Clifton Hargrove's head man, the one who had been following her since St. Louis. Grace Turner stepped backward, through Edwin Wallace's front door and closed it behind her. Edwin stared at her. "There is a man at the end of your drive," she said, and her voice was remarkably steady for someone whose heart was trying to exit through her ribcage, "who has been sent to bring me back to a man who will either marry me against my will or have me killed for knowing what I know. And I understand that I have arrived at the wrong place, and that you did not invite me here, and that you have every right to send me away. But if you open that door right now, you will be handing me to someone who does not mean me well, and I do not think you are that kind of man." Edwin Wallace looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the door. He looked back at her. Something moved across his face, something complicated and quick, like weather changing over open land. "Get away from the window," he said. Grace moved away from the window. Edwin lifted the curtain with one finger and looked out at the drive, and in the remaining light she could see the line of his jaw tighten and his hand come to rest, almost unconsciously, on the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The rider at the end of the drive sat his horse for a long moment and then turned and rode back toward the road. Edwin let the curtain fall. He turned around and looked at Grace Turner standing in the middle of his kitchen with her carpet bag at her feet and her chin lifted and her green eyes very steady and very frightened, and he did something that surprised them both. He put a pot of coffee on the stove. "You had better tell me everything," he said, "and I mean every single thing, because I don't take well to secrets on my own property." Grace Turner sat down at the kitchen table and told Edwin Wallace everything. She told him about her father, James Turner, who had been a bookkeeper for the Mississippi Valley Freight and Shipping Company in St. Louis. She told him about the false manifests, about the government cattle that were being stolen and sold, and the paperwork that was meant to make them disappear. She told him about the night in 1877 when her father had refused to sign his name to one more fraudulent document, and about the accident 3 days later that everyone in the city had called an accident except for Grace, who had found the note her father left folded inside his Bible, a note that named Clifton Hargrove and said only, "If something happens to me, you will know it was not chance." She told him about the 5 years of silence, of watching and waiting and being careful, of living in Hargrove's orbit because leaving suddenly would have drawn attention, and about how she had slowly, carefully arranged a new life for herself on paper, saving money, building a correspondence, and preparing to vanish in a way that would look natural. She told him about the letter to Warren Wallace, about the matrimonial bureau, about the plan to arrive in New Mexico territory as someone's bride and disappear from Clifton Hargrove's reach entirely. Edwin listened to all of it without interrupting. He drank his coffee. He refilled her cup without being asked. When she finished, he sat for a moment looking at his hands on the table, and then he looked up at her. "That note your father left," he said. "Do you still have it?" "I have it memorized," Grace said. "I burned the original so it could never be used against my mother." "And your mother?" "She married a dry goods merchant in Cincinnati 2 years ago. She is safe. She does not know where I am. That was intentional." Edwin nodded slowly. The lamp on the table cast a warm pool of light between them, and outside the window the New Mexico night was enormous and full of stars and completely indifferent to their particular crisis. "What does this man Hargrove want from you specifically?" Edwin asked. "He wants to marry me," Grace said. "My father left me a very small inheritance. More importantly, he knows that I know what I know, and he would rather control that than fear it." "Marriage as a trap," Edwin said. "Marriage as a cage," Grace said. "There is a difference." Something shifted in Edwin's expression when she said that. Something that might have been recognition or might have been admiration. He leaned back in his chair and studied her with those dark, serious eyes that she was already learning were the truest thing about him, the place where he kept what he actually thought and felt when the rest of his face was being careful. "You can have Warren's room," he said finally. "Until we figure out what comes next," Grace blinked. "You are not sending me away." "I told you to leave and you stepped backward into my house," Edwin said, and there was something almost dry in his voice, almost the ghost of a different version of himself that could afford to find things amusing. "I figure the universe was trying to tell me something." She slept that night in a dead man's room with a chair wedged under the door handle, not because she was afraid of Edwin, but because old habits required it. She lay in the dark listening to the enormous silence of the New Mexico night, which was a completely different silence than the city silence she had grown up with, and she thought about the look on Edwin's face when she had said the word cage, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she might actually be safe. Edwin Wallace did not sleep at all. He sat on the front porch in the dark with the rifle across his knees and a cup of cold coffee going untouched beside him, and he thought about Warren. Warren had been the one who made plans. Warren had been the one who placed the advertisement, who wrote the letters, who had the idea that the ranch needed a woman's hand to run properly, and that he was tired enough of loneliness to do something about it. Edwin had teased him about it in the gentle, private way that brothers tease each other about things that are secretly understood to be wise. Warren had died before the plan had any chance to become anything. And now Warren's plan had delivered someone to Edwin's door, not a woman who had been writing letters to Warren and building something with him, but a stranger, a woman who had chosen his dead brother's name off a list and arrived at his home carrying a secret that could get them both killed. Edwin was an honest man. He had always been an honest man. His father had built the Wallace Ranch on 60 acres and 30 cattle, and the kind of integrity that does not need an audience. And Edwin had inherited that foundation along with the deed and the debt and the particular loneliness that comes from working land you love without anyone to love alongside you. The loneliness had gotten considerably more complicated in the last 6 weeks, and considerably more complicated again in the last 3 hours. He thought about the way Grace Turner had looked when she told him about her father, not like a woman performing grief for sympathy. Like a woman who had carried something heavy for so long that the weight had become part of her posture, and who was perhaps, for the first time, setting it down on a table in front of another person and trusting that they would not use it against her. He thought about the rider at the end of the drive. He thought about Harlan Briggs because he knew the name. Harlan Briggs had a reputation in the territory, the kind of reputation that travels ahead of a man and warns people to be careful. He was not the worst thing the West had to offer, but he was a considerable distance from the best. And the fact that Clifton Hargrove had sent him 400 miles to retrieve one woman said something very specific about how important that retrieval was. Edwin stayed on the porch until the sky turned gray and then pale gold, and then the full brilliant blue of a New Mexico morning. And by the time he heard movement in the kitchen, he had made up his mind about several things. Grace Turner was awake before sunrise, which Edwin discovered when he came inside and found her at his stove, having apparently located his supplies by quiet investigation, making corn dodgers in the cast iron skillet with a competence that suggested she had been cooking since she could reach a stove. She turned when she heard the door and looked at him with a directness that he was already understanding was fundamental to her character. She did not look away when other people might have looked down. I was not sure how long you planned to feed me, she said, so I decided to demonstrate my usefulness immediately. I was not planning to stop feeding you, Edwin said. She looked at him carefully, trying to read whether that meant what it sounded like it meant. You said we would figure out what comes next, she said. I did, he said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, and she turned back to the skillet, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and made the whole room feel warmer than it was. I've been thinking about it. And Harlan Briggs will go back to wherever he's staying tonight and report that he found you, Edwin said. He doesn't know yet whether you're here or whether you kept moving. He saw a woman at a door, but he couldn't have gotten close enough in that light to be certain. That gives us some time, but not much. Grace set the corn dodgers on a plate and brought it to the table and sat across from him. You keep saying us. You notice things, Edwin said. It is a survival skill, she said. He looked at her steadily. You're in my house. That makes it my problem too, whether I invited it or not. I'm not in the habit of throwing a problem out the door and pretending it's gone because I can't see it anymore. Grace picked up a corn dodger and held it between her hands. What is your plan? First, I need to know something, Edwin said. The note your father left, the one you memorized, is it enough? As evidence, Grace considered. It names Hargrove directly. It describes the specific manifests, the dates, the names of the government agents who were being deceived. My father was methodical. He was a bookkeeper. Even his private notes read like documentation. So if that note reached the right people, Edwin said slowly, the federal marshal's office, a judge who isn't in Hargrove's pocket, then Clifton Hargrove would face a federal indictment, Grace said. Yes. My father built a very careful case in that note, and then sealed it with the acknowledgement that he was going to refuse to cooperate further and that he believed his life was in danger as a result. That is not a small thing, Edwin said. No, said Grace. It is not a small thing. It is why he has sent Harlan Briggs 400 miles. Edwin was quiet for a moment. The morning sounds of the ranch were beginning outside, the horses in the corral, the distant bellowing of cattle, the ordinary machinery of a working day that had nothing to do with any of this. I know a man in Santa Fe, Edwin said. His name is Thomas Court. He's a federal deputy marshal, and more importantly, he is a man I have trusted for 12 years. If we can get you to Santa Fe without Briggs following, and if you can write out that note from memory in detail, Thomas Court is the kind of man who will listen and the kind of man who will act. Grace set down the corn dodger. Her hands were steady. You are talking about taking a significant risk on behalf of a woman you met last night. I'm talking about doing something right, Edwin said, and the simplicity of it, the absolute lack of theater in the way he said it, was the thing that finally, irrevocably broke through the last of her careful distance, because Grace Turner had spent 5 years in the company of men who did things for reasons that were always complicated, and here was a man who apparently did things simply because they were right, and she did not entirely know what to do with that. All right, she said. Then that is what we will do. What they did not do was go immediately to Santa Fe, because Harlan Briggs had not gone anywhere. Edwin found out 2 days later from his nearest neighbor, a cattle rancher named Obadiah Flowers, who came by for the loan of a harness pin and stayed for coffee and news, that there was a man asking questions in the town of Silo Creek, which was the nearest settlement to the Wallace Ranch, 8 miles east. The man was describing a woman, 24 years old, dark auburn hair, green eyes, traveling alone. He was offering good money for information. Edwin listened to Obadiah Flowers describe this and kept his face entirely neutral, and Grace Turner sat at the other end of the kitchen working on a mending pile she had created for herself out of a collection of Edwin's shirts that had been waiting for attention, and she also kept her face entirely neutral, though her hands on the needle and thread were very still. After Obadiah Flowers left, Edwin stood at the window for a long time. He settled in for a while, Grace said quietly. Which means Hargrove gave him time and money and told him not to come back without me. What I want to know, Edwin said, is how he tracked you to this territory at all. You said you were careful. Grace set down the shirt she was mending. "Mrs. Pritchett," she said, "at the matrimonial bureau in Kansas City. She knew my real name. I paid her well, but Hargrove has deeper pockets than I do." The betrayal in her voice was quiet and old, the kind of betrayal that has been understood and processed and accepted but still leaves a mark. "She sold you," Edwin said. "She sold me," Grace agreed. She probably told him I had written to a rancher in New Mexico Territory named Wallace, and that I had left Kansas City on the 9th of April. He would have had men covering the territories from there. Edwin turned from the window. "So Briggs doesn't know which Wallace ranch specifically. Otherwise he'd have come to the door." "He knows I arrived in this general area," Grace said. "He is narrowing it down. He has time to be methodical about it." "Then we can't wait for him to finish being methodical," Edwin said. This was when Edwin made the decision that changed both of their lives, though neither of them understood its full weight at the time. He decided not to take Grace to Santa Fe alone. He sent a letter to Thomas Court first, by way of a trusted writer named Pedro Salazar who worked on the ranch and who could be trusted with his life, and had been on several occasions. The letter explained the situation in careful, factual terms and asked Court to come to the Wallace Ranch if possible, or to send instructions if not. In the 12 days they waited for a reply, something happened between Grace Turner and Edwin Wallace that neither of them had planned for and neither of them was entirely sure how to handle. They talked. This was not a small thing. Edwin Wallace was not by nature a man given to talking. He had grown up on a ranch with a father who expressed love through work and a brother who expressed it through laughter. And the space in between had been filled with the particular quiet of men who communicate through action and proximity, and the understanding that words, when they come, mean something. Grace Turner had spent 5 years being very careful with her words in the company of dangerous people, and as a result, she had developed a habit of precision, of saying exactly what she meant and no more, because too many words in the wrong company was a liability. These two habits, Edwin's quiet and Grace's precision, turned out to be extraordinarily compatible. They talked over dinner, which Grace had taken over cooking with a gentle decisiveness that Edwin found he could not object to and did not want to. They talked in the evenings on the front porch when the day's work was done, and the sky was turning its impossible colors over the desert landscape. They talked in the mornings over coffee before the ranch demanded their attention, and after a few days, Edwin began to direct her attention to the things that needed doing on the property, not as a way of using her labor, but as a way of sharing his life with her, which was the only way he knew to share anything. Grace learned the names of the horses. She learned which ones could be trusted and which ones were complicated. She learned the smell of the land and the sound the wind made in the particular formation of rocks at the north end of the property. And she learned that Edwin Wallace talked most easily when his hands were occupied with work. And so she put herself in his vicinity when he was working, and found that in those moments he would say things he might not have said otherwise. He told her about Warren. He told her about the way Warren had laughed, which was very sudden and very loud, and always slightly startling no matter how many times you heard it. He told her about the plan Warren had had for the south pasture, and about the argument they had had over the fence line in the fall of last year, and about how he would give every acre of the ranch to have that argument again. Grace listened to all of it with complete attention, the way she listened to everything, and when he finished she did not offer him comfort in words, because she understood that he did not need words. He needed the thing she gave him instead, which was the acknowledgement of a person who had truly heard. "He would have liked you," Edwin said one evening, and the words came out in the quieter register of things that are simply true. "How do you know?" Grace asked. "Because you're not easy to like and you're not trying to be," Edwin said. Warren had no patience for people who performed themselves. He said life was too short to watch the theater of someone else's impression management. Grace turned her head to look at him in the fading light. "Is that also something you believe?" Edwin looked at her for a moment. I think life's too short for a lot of things I've been wasting it on, he said. The reply was not what she had expected, and it landed differently than he might have intended, or perhaps exactly as he had intended. She could not entirely tell yet, and that uncertainty was itself something new and interesting to her, the experience of a person she had not yet fully decoded, which, given the quality of her attention, was unusual. "Edwin," she said. "Yes. Are you going to keep forgetting to send me away?" There was a pause, and then the very slight, very real curve at the corner of his mouth that she was learning to recognize as his version of a full smile. "Looks that way," he said. Pedro Salazar returned from Santa Fe on the 13th day with a letter from Thomas Court, and the letter was good news delivered in careful professional language. Court had been aware of Clifton Hargrove's name in connection with federal investigations for 2 years. There was a case building, but it had a missing element, a witness with direct knowledge and documented evidence. He asked Edwin to bring Grace to Santa Fe by a specific route that he outlined in the letter, arriving on a specific date 4 days hence, and he told Edwin to trust no one between here and there. The part of the letter that Edwin read twice was the final paragraph, which said, "I am sorry about Warren, Edwin. I should have written sooner. Bring your guest safely and we will get this settled." That night at dinner, Grace read the letter 3 times and then set it down and looked at Edwin with something in her expression that was new, something that might have been tears if she had been a different kind of woman, but was instead a kind of shining intensity. "This could actually work," she said, and the word actually contained inside it everything she had not allowed herself to fully believe for 5 years. "It's going to work," Edwin said, and he said it with the absolute straightforward conviction of a man who does not say things he does not mean. "You cannot know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm going to act like it's true until it is, which in my experience is most of what making something happen requires." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "Where did you come from?" she said, and it was not really a question. "Same place I've always been," Edwin said. 600 acres of New Mexico desert, 1 dead father, 1 dead brother, and a kitchen table that fits 2 people considerably better than it fits 1. The journey to Santa Fe was 4 days through country that was beautiful and demanding, and not a little dangerous. And they made it on horseback, because a wagon would have been too slow and too visible. Edwin knew the land, and he chose their route with the care of a man who has been reading this particular landscape his whole life. And Grace rode with a competence that surprised him, until she told him that her father had taught her to ride before she could read, because he had believed that a person who could not move themselves quickly under their own power was a person at the mercy of everyone else. "Your father sounds like someone I would have admired," Edwin said on the second morning, as they made camp in a shallow canyon with a thin ribbon of water running through it. "He was," Grace said. "He was also someone who died because he was too honest to save himself." She paused. "I have thought about that for 5 years, about whether his honesty was brave or foolish. And what have you concluded? That brave and foolish are often the same action," Grace said, "and that the distinction gets made by whatever happens afterward." Edwin looked at her across the small fire he had built to boil their coffee. The night was very cold and very clear, and the fire was their small island of warmth in the enormous dark of the New Mexico desert. "Do you think about staying?" he said. The question came out before he had fully decided to ask it, which was unusual for him. Grace was quiet for a moment. "In New Mexico." "On the ranch," Edwin said, and the directness of it, his absolute refusal to be indirect about the thing he meant, made something catch in her chest like a spur catches on cloth and hold. "That is a very significant question," she said carefully. "I know what it is," Edwin said. "We have known each other less than 3 weeks," she said. "I know that too," he said, "and you are asking it anyway." "I'm not very good at wanting things and pretending I don't," Edwin said. "Warren always said it was one of my significant character flaws. I've come to think of it as a virtue." The fire crackled between them. An owl called somewhere in the canyon walls and was answered by silence. Grace Turner looked at Edwin Wallace across the fire with the full weight of her considerable attention, and she thought about all the things she was. She was a woman who had fled a dangerous man. She was a woman carrying a secret. She was a woman who had arrived at the wrong ranch by mistake and been given coffee and a chair and a consistent, utterly unperformed kindness that she had no context for because it was entirely unlike anything she had experienced in the past 5 years. And she admitted to herself with the precision she applied to all true things, a woman who was very much in the process of falling in love with the man on the other side of this fire. "Ask me again," she said, "after Santa Fe." "Fair enough," said Edwin. They arrived in Santa Fe on the evening of the 4th day and went directly to Thomas Court's office, which was a solid adobe building 2 streets off the plaza, and Court himself was there waiting, a compact, careful man in his early 40s with a marshal's badge and the particular stillness of someone who has spent considerable time in situations that require it. He shook Edwin's hand and then turned to Grace and said, "Miss Turner, I have been hoping to find you for 2 years. I didn't know you existed, but I knew someone like you had to." Grace sat in Court's office for 3 hours. She wrote out her father's note from memory, word for word, every date and name and manifest number and vessel name that her father had recorded in the methodical way of a man who kept records as instinctively as other men kept tools. She wrote it in her father's own organizational style, because she had spent so much time with the original that she had absorbed not just the content but the form of it. Court read every page she produced with focused intensity, occasionally asking a clarifying question and making a note when she answered. Edwin sat in a chair against the wall throughout, not intruding, not absent, simply there in the way that he was present for things, the way that a good foundation is present, functional and solid and unremarked upon until you consider what would exist without it. When Court finished reading, he set the papers down carefully and looked up. "This is enough," he said. "More than enough. Combined with what we already have on the shipping records, this completes the case. I will have a federal warrant for Clifton Hargrove within the week, and that warrant will reach St. Louis before the end of the month." "What about Harlan Briggs?" Grace asked. "I can have a warrant for Briggs as well," Court said. "What you've described of his activities over the past weeks constitutes harassment, and given the underlying crime, conspiracy. He'll know the warrant is coming when Hargrove is arrested, and at that point his options will be to run or to cooperate. Men like Briggs generally cooperate." Grace sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. It was the first fully safe breath she had taken in 5 years. She felt it differently from all the breaths that had come before it, as though her lungs had been working with a reduced capacity for years without her fully realizing it, and only now, in this solid adobe office in Santa Fe, were they able to expand completely. Edwin was watching her from across the room. He was not pretending not to watch. Court gathered the papers and locked them in his strongbox and stood and shook Grace's hand with both of his. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Turner," he said. "Your father would be very proud." The words broke something loose in her that she had held very tightly for a very long time, and she did not weep, because she was Grace Turner and she had not wept since the morning she burned her father's note. But her eyes were very bright and her voice, when she said thank you, had a quality in it that was different from her usual precise steadiness. They stayed that night at a hotel in Santa Fe, separate rooms, and in the morning over breakfast Edwin asked his question again. "I told you to ask me after Santa Fe," Grace said. "We are after Santa Fe," Edwin pointed out. "We are having breakfast in Santa Fe, which is definitionally the morning after Santa Fe." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, genuinely and fully, without any of the management she usually applied to her expressions, and it was, he thought, the best sound he had heard in a very long time. Possibly the best sound he had ever heard, and he was a man who loved music and wind over the desert and the sound of the ranch waking up in the morning. "Edwin Wallace," she said. "Grace Turner," he said. "You are asking me if I want to stay at your ranch." "I am asking you if you want to make it your ranch too," Edwin said. There is a difference, as someone once told me. She looked at him across the breakfast table in the hotel in Santa Fe, with the morning light coming through the window and the sounds of the city coming to life outside. And she thought about cages and about choices, and about the fact that this was the first time in years that she was making a choice from a position of freedom rather than from a position of necessity, and that the choice she wanted to make was the same one either way. Yes, she said. Edwin Wallace did not perform happiness. He did not make a speech or take her hand or say anything dramatic. He simply looked at her with those dark eyes that held what was real in him, and what was in them then was so clear and so complete that it required nothing else. "Good," he said. "I'll finish my eggs." She threw a biscuit at him. He caught it without looking up from his plate and ate it, and that was, in its entirety, the moment Grace Turner understood that she was going to be happy. They rode back to the Wallace Ranch over 4 days, and the return journey was different from the journey to Santa Fe, in the way that everything is different once a decision has been made. The same country, the same horses, the same camps in the evening with coffee boiling over small fires, but the quality of the silence between them had changed entirely. It was no longer the silence of two people being careful with each other. It was the silence of two people who have agreed to stop being careful, which is a much more comfortable thing. On the third night of the return journey, camped in a stand of juniper trees with a good view of the trail behind them, Edwin told her something he had not told anyone. He said that, after Warren died, he had almost sold the ranch. He said he had stood in the kitchen in the first week, in the peculiar suspended horror of early grief, and thought that without Warren the land was only land, that the thing that had given it meaning, which was the shared purpose between them, was gone, and that without that shared purpose he was only a man standing on dirt. "What changed your mind?" Grace asked. "Warren would have told me I was being an idiot," Edwin said, "and he would have been right. He would have said the land doesn't need a reason to matter beyond that it's the land, and that people come and people go, but you don't sell the home your father built because you're having a dark night." "Warren sounds like he was very wise," Grace said. "Warren was very irritating in exactly the way that people are irritating when they're right," Edwin said. Grace smiled. "I think I would have liked him. He would have been very smug about the fact that his advertisement brought you here," Edwin said. "He would have pointed that out every single day for the rest of my life." Grace looked at the fire. "He would not have been entirely wrong," she said quietly. Edwin looked at her across the fire, the way he had looked at her across the fire on the way to Santa Fe, except that the question between them was different now. Now it was not the question of what comes next. Now it was the much more interesting question of how. "When we get back," Edwin said. "Yes. I'd like to do this properly," he said. "If you're willing, there's a minister in Silo Creek, nothing elaborate but proper." Grace looked at him carefully. "You are proposing to me." "I am," Edwin said. "I am doing it without a ring because I don't have one with me, which is an oversight I intend to correct as soon as we reach a town with a jeweler. I am doing it on the third night of a camping trip after knowing you for less than a month, which is fast by most standards. I am doing it honestly, which means I am telling you that I have thought about it very carefully and I am certain, and I don't say things I'm not certain of." Grace was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire settled and Edwin did not break the silence, because he was a man who understood that some silences were for thinking and should not be disturbed. "I have spent 5 years making choices because I had no other options," Grace said at last. "I am aware that this might look the same from the outside. A woman without a home, without a family nearby, without resources, accepting a proposal from the only available man. It might look that way," Edwin agreed, not dismissing it. "But it does not feel that way," Grace said. "And I have learned to trust the difference between how things look and how they feel because that difference has kept me alive." She looked up at him. "Yes, Edwin, I will marry you." He moved around the fire and sat beside her, and for the first time he took her hand, holding it in both of his, the way Thomas Court had shaken her hand, with both hands, which was something she had noticed he did with things he wanted to hold carefully. They sat beside each other in the juniper-scented dark, with the enormous New Mexico sky above them and the fire slowly burning down. And it was very peaceful and very certain, and absolutely nothing like the cautious, terrified existence of the past 5 years. They arrived back at the Wallace Ranch on a Thursday afternoon to find Pedro Salazar and the other ranch hand, a young man of 20 named Carlos Montoya who had worked for Warren, and who had stayed on without being asked because the ranch was his livelihood, and Edwin was a fair employer, both going about their normal work. Harlan Briggs was nowhere in evidence. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Thomas Court, which Pedro had collected from the post office in Silo Creek. The letter informed Edwin and Grace that the federal warrant for Clifton Hargrove had been issued and executed, that Hargrove had been taken into custody in St. Louis, and that Harlan Briggs, on learning of the warrant, had presented himself to the territorial marshal's office in Albuquerque and agreed to provide full testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. "It is over," Grace said, holding the letter. She read it again, the way she had reread Thomas Court's first letter, making sure it was real. "It is over," Edwin confirmed. She sat down very suddenly on the kitchen bench, not from weakness but from the physical reality of 5 years of weight being removed all at once, which turns out to require a moment to accommodate. Edwin sat beside her and put his arm around her, not saying anything, because this was a moment that did not need words, only the warmth of another person's presence, and the acknowledgement that some things deserve the space of being fully felt before anything else is done about them. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself feel it. The truth was that she also allowed herself to weep, quietly and not for long, not in grief, but in the specific release of something that has been held rigid for years finally being permitted to let go. And Edwin held her through it without comment, and without the kind of discomfort that some people feel around other people's emotions, because Edwin Wallace had spent years in the company of a working ranch, and a grief that he had not known what to do with. And he had learned that the right response to most hard things was simply to be present for them. They were married 3 weeks later at the small church in Silo Creek. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldous Hines, a serious and kindly man who had been marrying and burying people in this part of New Mexico territory since 1873, and who conducted the proceedings with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that the words mattered and were not to be rushed. Grace wore the best dress she had, which was the one she had arrived in, now pressed and altered by her own hand to fit properly, a deep green that she had chosen in Kansas City because it was practical and did not show dust. It was not a wedding dress by any conventional standard. She wore her hair up for the occasion, which was a thing she rarely did, and Edwin, who had never said anything about her appearance in any direct way, said when he saw her only, "You look like yourself, only more so," which was not a conventional compliment but which was, coming from Edwin, better than any conventional compliment would have been. Edwin wore a clean shirt and his best vest, and the kind of clean-shaved face that clearly cost him some effort. And Grace, who had gotten used to the way he looked at the end of a working day with the day's dust and work on him, thought that he was remarkably handsome in either version, and that she was unreasonably fortunate. The witnesses were Pedro Salazar and Carlos Montoya and Obadiah Flowers, who had been told only that there was to be a wedding and who had arrived with his wife, a tall woman named Bess Flowers, who brought a pie and wept happily throughout the ceremony because, as she explained afterward, any wedding in this part of the territory was cause for celebration given how few there were. Reverend Hines said the words, Edwin and Grace said theirs, and there was a ring, a simple gold band that Edwin had bought from the one jeweler in Silo Creek, a man named Kowalski who sold watches and hardware and occasionally jewelry, and who had the ring sized correctly on the first try, which Edwin took as a sign. When Reverend Hinn said the final words, and Edwin placed the ring on Grace's finger, and they looked at each other in the small, clear light of the church. There was between them one of those moments of complete stillness that sometimes occur in the middle of ordinary life, when time seems to pause itself and offer you a clear view of the thing you have, and you are able, just for a second, to understand its full value before the forward motion of living resumes. Then Obadiah Flowers said, "Congratulations," rather too loudly, and Bess Flowers laughed and wept simultaneously, and Carlos Montoya shook Edwin's hand with such enthusiasm that the moment ended in the best possible way, in the warmth and noise of people genuinely glad about something good. The first year of their marriage was a working year in the best sense of the word. The ranch had suffered during the period of Warren's illness and death, and the subsequent months of Edwin doing everything himself, and there was a great deal of catching up to be done. Grace did not sit to the side of this work. She had grown up in a city, but she had the fundamental practical intelligence of a person who had always had to make things work, and she applied it to ranch life with a thoroughness that impressed Edwin and occasionally made him feel slightly lazy by comparison, though he was one of the hardest working people she had ever met. She learned to manage the household accounts with the same methodical care her father had applied to his bookkeeping, and the ranch's finances, which had been haphazardly maintained since Warren's death, were organized and clarified under her hand within the first month. She identified 2 areas where money was being lost to inefficiency and fixed them. Edwin watched this happen with a combination of admiration and the slight bemusement of a man who has always been good at the land and the animals, and is discovering that the business of the land is a somewhat different skill. "You're a better bookkeeper than I am," he said one evening, looking over the ledger she had organized. "My father was a bookkeeper," Grace said. "It would have been strange if I hadn't learned." "I suppose when I picture a rancher's wife I wasn't picturing someone who reorganizes the accounts," Edwin said. "What were you picturing?" Grace asked. Edwin looked at her. "Honestly, I wasn't picturing anyone specific," he said. "I had reached a place where I thought the ranch might just be mine alone, that I had missed whatever window there was for the other thing." "Edwin," Grace said, "yes, you are 30 years old. I am aware. That is not a missed window, that is barely through the door." The corner of his mouth curved. "Said the woman who showed up at the wrong ranch." "Said the woman who showed up at the exact right ranch by complete accident," Grace corrected, "which, when you think about it, says something very specific about the nature of Providence." He laughed. Fully, genuinely, the way she now knew he laughed when something actually amused him as opposed to the polite variation. It was a sound she had worked hard to earn in the first weeks of knowing him, and which now came more easily, and she loved it unreasonably much. In the fall of 1882, Thomas Court rode out to the Wallace Ranch to deliver the news in person that Clifton Hargrove had been convicted on 3 counts of federal fraud and 1 count of conspiracy in the death of James Turner, Grace's father. He would serve a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Court also brought a document establishing that the shipping records pertaining to the stolen government cattle had been reviewed, that the relevant government parties had been notified, and that Grace Turner's testimony, submitted through her father's memorized notes, had been entered into the federal record. "Your father's name has been cleared," Court said, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the last of the apple cake Grace had made 2 days before. "The record now shows that he refused to participate in the fraud and that he was removed for his refusal. His reputation is intact." Grace sat with that for a moment. She looked out the window at the New Mexico afternoon, at the horses in the corral and the distant blue of the mountains, and the enormous, ordinary life of the ranch proceeding around her. "He would have liked to know that," she said. "He made it possible to know it," Court said. "Everything came from what he recorded." After Court left, Edwin found Grace at the south fence line, standing and looking out over the land with her hands on the top rail. He came and stood beside her, and they stayed like that for a while without talking, because there were things that did not need talk. "It is truly over," Grace said at last. "Yes," Edwin said. "My father's work mattered. His honesty mattered." "Yes," Edwin said. She turned to look at him. "I have something to tell you," she said. Edwin looked at her, reading the quality of her face with the precision that came from months of loving attention, and something shifted in his expression, something warm and questioning and carefully held. "Are you?" he began. "Yes," she said. The word hung between them in the fall afternoon, suspended in the blue air over the ranch that had been Warren's dream and was now theirs. And Edwin Wallace did what he did when things were too large for his usual economy of expression. He put both his arms around his wife and held her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. Their son was born in the spring of 1883, in the bedroom of the Wallace ranch house, delivered by a woman named Dolores Montoya, who was Carlos Montoya's aunt and who had been delivering babies in this part of the territory for 30 years, and who regarded the whole process with the brisk competence of a professional. Edwin spent the labor in the kitchen in a state of rigid anxiety that he attempted to disguise as calm, and that fooled no one. And when Dolores Montoya brought him into the bedroom, and he saw Grace lying in the bed with the baby in her arms, he sat on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands for a moment, and did something he had not done since Warren died. Grace put her free hand on the back of his head and held it there, and when he looked up his eyes were wet and completely unashamed about it. "Come and see him," she said. The baby was red-faced and vigorous and had, impossibly, the look already of someone who had opinions about things. Edwin looked at him for a long time. "James," he said. Grace looked at him. "For your father," Edwin said, "if that's what you want." "James Warren Wallace," Grace said. "For both of them." Edwin nodded. He reached out, and the baby wrapped one tiny hand around his finger with a grip that was, for someone 3 hours old, remarkably confident. "Hello, James Warren Wallace," Edwin said quietly. "You have a very good mother, and I intend to try hard enough that one day you might think you have a good father too." Grace laughed softly, still tired from the work of the morning. "You are already a good father," she said. "You have been one for the past 9 months." James Warren Wallace turned out to have his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness, which was a combination that would cause both of them enormous amounts of work over the next several years, and that they would not have traded for any alternative. In the summer of 1883, Pedro Salazar left the Wallace Ranch to take up land of his own, which had been his plan for 3 years, and which Edwin supported with a loan that he told Pedro was a gift, and that Pedro refused to accept as a gift, and repaid in full over the following 2 years. Carlos Montoya stayed and was promoted, which he accepted with the same quiet steadiness with which he did everything, and a man named Gideon Park joined the ranch that fall, a former Buffalo soldier from the 9th Cavalry who had mustered out in New Mexico, and who was one of the best horsemen Edwin had ever encountered. Gideon Park brought with him a history of the territory and a knowledge of the land that complemented Edwin's own in useful ways, and he brought also a quiet dignity and a direct intelligence that Grace responded to immediately, and he became over time a fixture of the ranch in the way that good people become fixtures, not through intention but through the accumulation of trust. There was a conversation, one day in the fall of 1883, between Grace and Edwin that had been building for a while. Edwin had been offered a contract by a cattle buyer out of Colorado that would require him to expand the herd significantly, and expanding the herd would require purchasing the 40 acres that bordered the ranch to the north, which were owned by an aging rancher named Silas Pruitt, who was willing to sell. The contract was a significant opportunity. The expansion was a significant risk. They had the conversation at the kitchen table in the evening after James was asleep, with the accounts open between them and the lamp burning, and it was the first significant business decision they made together, and it was also, Grace understood, a test of a particular kind. Not a test of trust exactly, because trust between them was not in question. A test of the shape of their partnership, of whether Edwin Wallace, who had run this ranch alone, and before that with Warren, and before that had grown up in a household run by a man whose authority was unquestioned, would make real room for her judgment, or whether her role in the accounts was a managed inclusion rather than a genuine one. He spread the figures out on the table and he said, "Tell me what you see." She told him what she saw. She told him about the risk in the expansion timing, about the weather patterns she had observed over the past year that suggested a dry summer ahead, about the strain on the water sources that a significantly expanded herd would create. She told him also about the opportunity, about the Colorado market and the contract terms and the long-term value of establishing a relationship with a reliable buyer. She told him her recommendation, which was to take the contract but to negotiate a phased delivery schedule that would allow them to expand the herd more slowly, reducing their exposure if the dry summer she was predicting materialized. Edwin listened to all of it with his full attention, the same attention he gave everything that mattered. "That's better thinking than I was doing," he said. "You were thinking about it from the land side," Grace said. "I was thinking about it from the numbers side. We're both right, we just needed both." Edwin looked at her across the table. "Write up the terms you want," he said. "I'll take them to the buyer." The buyer accepted the modified terms. The summer was dry, as Grace had predicted, but the phased delivery schedule meant the ranch was not overextended, and they came through it in better shape than several of their neighbors. Obadiah Flowers, whose herd took a significant hit that summer, came to Edwin in October and asked, with a combination of embarrassment and genuine curiosity, how the Wallace Ranch had managed it. Edwin told him honestly that his wife had read the water levels in the spring and advised him to be cautious. Obadiah Flowers went home and had a long conversation with his wife Bess, and Bess Flowers, who had been trying to get Obadiah to take her opinions on ranch matters more seriously for 15 years, was unreasonably gratified by this development. In the spring of 1884, Grace received a letter from her mother in Cincinnati. Her mother, whose name was Helen Turner Marsh, as she now signed herself, having remarried to the dry goods merchant Grace had mentioned to Edwin in their first evening together, wrote to say that she had heard from a friend in St. Louis that Clifton Hargrove had been convicted and sentenced, and that she had wept for 3 days when she heard it. Helen wrote that she had never entirely believed in the accident that had taken James Turner, and that she had carried that disbelief quietly all these years, and that knowing now that the truth had been told, and that justice had been done, was something she did not have adequate words for. She also wrote that she had received Grace's letter from the previous fall, the one that informed her that she had settled in New Mexico territory and was married, and that she would very much like to come and meet Edwin and the baby if the invitation was extended. Grace wrote back that the invitation was very much extended and named a date in the summer. Helen Marsh arrived at the Wallace Ranch in July of 1884 on the Santa Fe stage, accompanied by her husband Albert Marsh, a kind and unremarkable man who was clearly devoted to Helen and who shook Edwin's hand with the considerable relief of a man meeting the son-in-law he had hoped his wife's daughter had found. The visit was several things at once. It was a reunion between Grace and her mother that carried with it the complicated weight of years of necessary distance and of everything that had happened in between, and there were conversations in those 2 weeks that did not happen with an audience and that no one was afterward required to report on. It was also Edwin meeting the last remaining piece of Grace's history. Helen Turner Marsh had a precision of speech and a directness of gaze that Edwin recognized immediately as the inheritance she had passed to her daughter, and he understood watching them together that Grace's particular quality of attention and her refusal to be indirect about the things that mattered were not things she had developed alone in the years of danger and careful living, but were things she had come from, and that made him see her origins with a kind of gratitude. James Warren Wallace, aged 1 year and some months, performed his usual repertoire of opinions and sturdy small-person independence for his grandmother, who was completely undone by him in the best possible way, and who held him with the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for something very good. On the evening before Helen and Albert's departure, Grace and Edwin sat on the front porch while Helen sat inside with the sleeping baby, and Albert Marsh had gone to bed early with the good-natured practicality of a man who knew when other people needed time. "She is well," Grace said. "Not a question." "She is," Edwin said. "She worries about you." "That's what mothers do, I suppose, but it's the good kind of worry now, the kind that doesn't have fear in it." Grace leaned her head back and looked at the stars. There were, as always in New Mexico, an unreasonable number of them. "I spent so much time being afraid," she said. "Not in a way that showed, but underneath everything always, for so long that I stopped noticing it as a separate thing. It just became the texture of being alive." "And now," Edwin said. Grace considered. She thought about the ranch, about the accounts and the horses and the kitchen that was hers and the land that had her husband's family history in it, and that was building her own family's history alongside it. She thought about James Warren Wallace asleep inside in his grandmother's arms. She thought about the feeling of waking up each morning without anything underneath the morning. "Now it is just a thing that used to be," she said. "I remember it the way you remember whether that has passed. It was real, but it is not here." Edwin reached over and took her hand the way he did, both of his around hers, careful and complete. "I am glad you came to the wrong ranch," he said. "You tried to send me away," she reminded him. "I was an idiot," he said, with the complete equanimity of a man who is secure enough to admit the obvious. "You were grieving and unprepared," Grace said. "And you chose decency anyway, which is the thing that matters about a person." Edwin looked at the stars. "Warren would be very smug about this entire situation," he said, "in the best possible way. He would find this whole thing extremely gratifying, and he would never once let me forget it." Grace smiled. "We will never let him be forgotten," she said. "That is the best response to smugness, gratitude." Edwin looked at her. In the lamplight from the window, in the enormous dark of the New Mexico night, she was so entirely herself, so entirely Grace Turner who had become Grace Wallace, that he felt the full, particular richness of having come to the right moment without planning it, the kind of life that feels like it was supposed to be. "I love you," he said, and it came out the same way everything came out with Edwin, direct and without decoration and entirely true. "I love you," Grace said the same way, the precision she applied to all real things. The year 1885 arrived with a late winter that was harsher than the previous two, and the Wallace Ranch came through it because of Edwin's preparation and Grace's foreknowledge of the supply requirements based on the previous year's patterns. And when the spring came, it came with the particular generosity that good seasons have after hard ones. Grace had been paying attention all winter to certain things, and by February she knew. She told Edwin the way she had told him the first time, which was directly and simply, standing in the kitchen after dinner, while James played on the floor with the set of wooden blocks that Gideon Park had carved for him as a Christmas gift. "We are having another baby," she said. Edwin looked at her and the same warmth moved across his face, older now than when she had first met him, but in every way that mattered more alive, and he said, "When?" "September, I think." He looked down at James, who was engaged in an architectural project of considerable ambition involving all the blocks simultaneously. "What do you think of that?" he asked his son. James Wallace, who was 2 years old and had views on most things, said no with great confidence and returned to his construction. Grace laughed. Edwin looked up at her, grinning, and she thought, as she often thought, that the best thing about loving Edwin Wallace was that it kept surprising her with how good it was, that it was not a thing that became familiar in the diminishing way that familiarity sometimes works, but a thing that became more known without becoming less interesting. The baby, born in September of 1885, was a girl. Grace delivered her as she had delivered James, with Dolores Montoya and Edwin at a cautious and anxious distance in the kitchen. And when the moment came and Dolores brought him in, he stood over the two of them for a long moment without speaking. "She is very beautiful," he said at last, in the voice he used for things he meant completely. "She looks like Warren," Grace said. Edwin looked closely. The baby had a particular arrangement of features that Grace was seeing for the first time, but that matched the one photograph they had of Warren Wallace, which sat on the mantelpiece in the sitting room. A serious young man looking at the camera with the same dark eyes and the same slight forward set to his brow. "She does," Edwin said, with a quality in his voice that was love and grief bound together in the way they sometimes are, inseparable, each making the other more true. "We will call her Frances," Grace said. "Frances Ellen Wallace, if you are willing." Edwin sat on the edge of the bed. "Ellen was my mother's name," he said. "I know," Grace said. He looked at her, and in his eyes was everything he had not said about what it meant to him that she had learned this and held it and offered it to him now in this moment. "Frances Ellen Wallace," he said. "Yes." The year moved on in the way that good years move, full of work and small pleasures, and the particular richness of a life that is being built by people who are paying attention to it. James Wallace grew into a child who was relentlessly curious and physically fearless, and who idolized Gideon Park, following him around the ranch with the focused devotion that small children give to people they have decided are fundamentally interesting. Gideon Park bore this with patient good humor and taught the boy things about horses and land and the kind of careful observational skill that comes from years of understanding terrain. Frances Ellen Wallace was a quieter child, with her father's watchfulness and her mother's precision, and she had the additional quality of being apparently certain from a very early age that she was correct about most things, which she frequently was, and which the family navigated with varying degrees of success. In the spring of 1886, a letter arrived from Helen Marsh in Cincinnati, asking whether there might be room for a longer visit that summer, and whether Albert would be considered an imposition. Grace wrote back that they were expanding the ranch house, that there was a room being built that would be called the guest room, but that everyone would understand was really her mother's room, and that Albert was welcome as long as he did not mind children and horses, both of which were in constant supply. Helen and Albert arrived in June and stayed 3 months, and it was during that visit that Grace understood something she had not entirely let herself understand before, that she was not only safe but genuinely, fully, and without reservation happy, in the way that happiness is when it has been fully earned, when it has been built rather than stumbled into, when every part of it is known and chosen. She and Edwin were sitting on the porch one evening with the sound of Helen inside reading to James and Frances, Albert having gone to bed with his usual practical timing, and the New Mexico night was enormous and full of stars as it always was, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way it got in the evenings when the day's work was done. "Edwin," Grace said. "Yes. Do you remember the night you told me to leave?" "I remember," he said. "You had coffee on before the sentence was finished," she said. "I had coffee on before I finished saying the words, yes," he said. "You knew," she said. "Even then, you knew you were not going to send me away." Edwin was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet about things that were true. "I knew something," he said carefully. "I did not know what I knew yet, but something about you standing in my kitchen was absolutely not going to be resolved by putting you back outside." "Harlan Briggs gave you an excuse," Grace said. "Harlan Briggs gave me a reason," Edwin said. "There is a difference." "A distinction I made first," she pointed out. "You make a great many good distinctions," he said. "It is one of the things I love about you." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the usual comfortable way of people who have learned the exact shape of each other, and the night around them was enormous and peaceful and full of the particular quality that the New Mexico sky has in summer, when the stars are so numerous they seem to be almost too many, almost excessive, as though the sky is being demonstrative about its abundance. "Edwin," Grace said again. Yes, he said. I think, she said, that you should not have a third child, a new baby, unless you want one. But for the record, I do not object to the idea. The arm around her shoulders tightened slightly. Is that so? He said. It is so, she said. Then I don't object to the idea either, Edwin said. In the spring of 1887, their second son was born, and they named him Oliver James Wallace, the first name for no particular antecedent but because Grace had always loved it, and the middle name for the great-grandfather of his mother's honesty. James Wallace, 4 years old, greeted his new brother with a scrutiny that suggested he was reserving his judgment, which Gideon Park said was the correct response to any new thing, and that showed the boy had good sense. Frances Wallace, 18 months old, looked at her new brother for approximately 1 minute and then went back to what she had been doing, which was disassembling a piece of harness equipment that she had found interesting. She has your priorities, Edwin told Grace. She has your focus, Grace told Edwin. Oliver James Wallace had, from the earliest observable evidence, the personality of a person who finds everything delightful, which turned out to be its own considerable force in a household that otherwise ran at a fairly high intellectual intensity. The Wallace Ranch in 1887 was a different enterprise than it had been in 1882. The herd was larger. The land extended to the north with the Prewitt Acres Incorporated. The house itself had been added to twice. The accounts were in excellent order, and the reputation of the ranch in the territory was solid and growing. Gideon Park had, some time before, expressed an interest in a piece of land adjacent to the Prewitt Acres that had come available, and Edwin and Grace had helped him secure it, with the same arrangement of a loan that was offered as a gift and accepted as a loan, because Gideon Park was that kind of man. He ran cattle on his own land and continued to work with the Wallace Ranch on a flexible arrangement that suited everyone. And on Sundays, he sometimes had dinner with the family, which James Wallace considered the best arrangement of the entire week. Carlos Montoya had left the ranch the previous year to marry a woman from Albuquerque named Rosa Espinoza, and had started his own operation south of the city, and they had parted with genuine mutual regard, with Edwin giving him a very good horse as a wedding gift and Grace giving him a set of account books organized with her characteristic thoroughness that Carlos had said, laughing, was the most practical gift he had ever received. Thomas Court visited the Wallace Ranch once a year when he was making his circuit through the territory, and he and Edwin sat on the porch and talked about the state of things, and Grace joined them because Thomas Court treated her as a full participant in any conversation and always had, and which was something she appreciated in the specific way of a woman who is aware of how unusual it is. In the fall of 1887, Court brought news that Clifton Hargrove had died in the federal penitentiary of a cardiac event, serving his 7th year of the 15-year sentence. Grace received this news sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He died knowing it was over. That is more justice than I once thought I would get." Court looked at her. "You are not troubled by it." "I am not glad he is dead," Grace said carefully. "I would have been content to have him serve his full sentence, but I find I have no grief for him either. He had years in which he could have chosen differently and chose what he chose." "That is a remarkably fair assessment," Court said. "My father was a remarkably fair man," Grace said. "I try to live up to it." After Court left, Edwin found her standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the late afternoon light on the land, and he came and stood beside her the way he always did, the steady, present warmth of him that she had stopped thinking of as a gift because it had become as fundamental as the land itself. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I was thinking about my father. About the fact that his case was fully settled and that everything he did mattered, and that the man who had him killed answered for it. And I was thinking that he never got to see any of this." She made a small gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the ranch, the children's sounds from the other room, the life that had grown out of the plan he had helped set in motion by leaving a letter in a Bible. "No," Edwin said quietly. "But he would have," Grace said. "If he had lived, he would have. He would have come to see his grandchildren and his son-in-law who barely speaks when there is nothing worth saying and who is completely honest and who puts coffee on before he is finished deciding to be kind." She looked at Edwin with the full weight of 5 years of loving him in her eyes. "He would have liked you very much." "I hope so," Edwin said. "He would have," Grace said. "You are exactly the kind of person he believed existed. He used to say that the world was full of people pretending to be better than they were, and that the great ones were the ones who did not bother pretending, because they had simply decided to be what they claimed." Edwin looked a little embarrassed, which was his standard response to direct praise, and which Grace found completely consistent and completely genuine and completely characteristic. "He sounds like someone who had very good judgment," Edwin said. "He had excellent judgment," Grace agreed. "He chose me as his daughter after all." Edwin laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen the way it always did, and from the other room James Wallace shouted "Papa," with the expectation of his full attention that 4-year-olds have, and Edwin looked at Grace with a quick bright look that was all warmth and mild amusement, and moved to go attend to the demands of his son. The years after that were the fullest years. The working years, the building years, the years in which the ranch became not just a business and a home but a legacy, the kind that accumulates slowly and does not announce itself, but that you can see clearly when you stand at enough distance. James Wallace grew up with his father's stubbornness and his mother's precision and a third quality that belonged to neither of them directly, but that had perhaps come from Warren Wallace by some inheritance of spirit, which was a sudden and infectious laugh that startled everyone who heard it, and that no one could resist. Frances Ellen Wallace grew up to be one of those people who sees through complications to the actual thing at the center of them, with a speed that was sometimes uncomfortable for the people in her vicinity, and which her parents were, privately, enormously proud of. Oliver James Wallace grew up with his delight in everything intact, which turned out to be its own particular kind of intelligence, the ability to find what was good in a thing and build on it, which made him an extremely effective person in any practical situation. Edwin and Grace Wallace grew old in the way that good marriages allow people to grow old, with more of themselves rather than less, each becoming more entirely what they had always been, his economy of expression sharpening into a kind of precision that matched hers, her directness softening at the edges into something that was still entirely clear, but that contained more patience, the patience of someone who has spent many years being entirely known and is not in a hurry. They were married for 41 years. The ranch grew and changed and weathered and persisted. The territory became a state. The century turned. The things that the Wild West had been became history, and they lived long enough to watch it become history, long enough to tell their children and their children's children about what it had actually been like, which was not what the stories later said but was its own complicated and real thing, beautiful and hard and indifferent and occasionally, in the right moment, completely extraordinary. On an evening in 1923, Edwin and Grace Wallace sat on the front porch of the Wallace Ranch house, which had been added to 4 times, and which bore on its doorframe the height marks of 3 children and 7 grandchildren recorded in pencil over 30 years, and the New Mexico sky was doing what it always did, which was providing an unreasonable number of stars. Grace was 70. Edwin was 69. They sat in the chairs that had replaced the original chairs that had replaced the original bench, on the porch that had been rebuilt twice and extended once, and they had been sitting on this porch in various configurations for 41 years, and it was still the best part of the day. "Edwin," Grace said. "Yes. Do you remember what you said to me the second night I was here?" "I said a great many things," Edwin said, "probably not all of them equally worth remembering." You said that life was too short for a lot of things you had been wasting it on, Grace said. Edwin was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. I remember, he said. What did you mean by it, she asked. At the time, what were you referring to? Being careful with things that didn't deserve that much carefulness, Edwin said after a moment. I had spent a long time being very measured about what I wanted and whether to want it. The ranch being present for the work, making sure things were properly done. All of it right, all of it mine, but very carefully held at a distance from anything that could disappoint me. And then I showed up at the wrong ranch, Grace said, and refused to leave, Edwin said, with the slight curve at the corner of his mouth that she had loved for 41 years. You forgot to send me away, she said. I forgot to send you away, he agreed. It was the most productive failure of memory I have ever had. Grace smiled in the evening light, and they sat together in the old, complete silence of people who have run out of need for anything beyond the simple fact of each other, which is not an empty silence but the fullest kind, the kind that can only be reached by the long road of an entire shared life, and which, when you have it, is worth everything the road cost. The stars were, as always in New Mexico, excessive in their number and their brightness, as though the sky had something to prove, and the ranch was quiet in the way it got in the evenings, and somewhere inside the house, a grandchild was making the specific noise of a child who has been put to bed and objects to it, and Edwin looked at Grace, and Grace looked at Edwin, and they were home.